Hello and welcome to Short Stories read and written by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along as I read this story, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You're listening to Mapping the Territory. I don't mean to lecture you, Marie said, catching herself only now that it was too late. It surprised him how quickly she had started going at it. He had been expecting the house, putting things in order, and feeling the hour of his friend's arrival draw ever closer. Then came the ring of the doorbell, the opening of the door, and suddenly there he was, listening to Marie talk about her conference again, about overfishing on the bay, and about the 3-year ban she proposed to fix it. He had forgotten what the bay was called. Marie had told him at one point, and from then on had called it the bay, sure that he knew what she meant. It was somewhere in the south coast, by the channel. Her lecture was a practice run for the conference that was 3 days away. She knew what she had to say, and had told him about it enough times that he figured he could have filled in for her in case she pulled out. Still, there was a lingering doubt in the back of her mind that she would make a mistake, and she wanted to prepare against this possibility while there was still time. She didn't mean to put them through this. "It's been on my mind, that's all," she said. She was nervous, and he sympathized with her, but that sympathy didn't help his patience much. Not wanting to sit through another practice run, Neil seized on a pause in the conversation. "Have any of you ever been to the bay?" he asked. All but Michael had. Had they ever fished? None of them had. Robert and Michael, eager to hear where this was going, were quick to answer. Marie was the last. Though he hadn't broken her off in mid-sentence, she had had more to say. But then, she thought to herself, they'd heard enough of her lecture and now wanted something else. Out on holiday by the south coast, he had gone for a walk, found a pier, and went to look at the people there. Some of them were fishing by the bay, and some of them, like himself, were watching the fishermen. Those that were fishing stood at the end of the pier or at the sides. Some of them, he noticed, were wet from the waist down from wading through the water. The weather then, as now, was pleasant. Sunny and warm, but not so hot that the fishermen abandoned their rods and went wading without thinking of finding fish. The fishermen were tanned or red and sunburnt, or hadn't been there long. As he talked, he kept his head turned mainly to where Marie sat and glanced around the table at the others. After watching the fishermen for a while, he realized that this was the bay Marie had been talking about. Even telling this story, he was no closer to remembering the name, though he remembered how it had been. "There weren't many fish when I was there," Neil said. "I went some time ago, so it must be a lot worse now. Of course, I was on the shore, and the fishing boats go out a lot further than that. I saw some people fishing, and they didn't have any fish that I could see. I asked them to be sure, and they showed me their catch, a couple of fish, small ones too." "What did they catch?" Michael asked. "I thought they were trout," Neil said. "I don't know my fish very well. They were small and thin and silver gray. To me, that's trout. There's enough of those in the bay. I thought I had a good chance of being right. I asked one of the fishermen about it, and he said trout were bigger. He told me what they were really called, but I forgot." He paused, trying to remember, and passed a hand through his hair. Ordinarily, he would have stood up and paced the room, but he couldn't do that with company present. He was careful about his habits. There were some he had managed to eliminate, and others, like his pacing, he could only restrain and redirect. "He said he caught some trout a while ago," Neil continued. "Banged them against the rocks while he was pulling them in. He pretended to hold a rod and swing a fish against a rock. If they thrash around a lot, that's what he does to stun them. The fish he caught, though, you can lift them clean out of the water." He showed Marie how small the fish had been with the span of his thumb and forefinger. "Not much bigger than that," he said. When the fisherman had talked about the size of his catch, Neil had thought of Marie. "It gets emptier every year," Neil had said to the fisherman, getting a little nod from him in return. "What did he do with them?" Marie asked. "He said he was glad he didn't use any bait, and I said it would have been a waste. I told him he should use them as bait to make up for his loss and catch something bigger, Neil said. Better lures than you can get at the store, but I don't know if he took my advice. Marie listened with interest now, and not, as before, with only an acceptance of the change in subject. She had looked in his direction, and now she looked at him. To hear Neil talk about the fisherman's catch was proof of her work's importance. Not that she was right, she had no doubts there. What it proved was that this was an immediate concern, one even Neil had noticed, and it gave her confidence in how her lecture would be received. Neil knew nothing of what his story meant to her, but he noticed and was pleased about the change in her attitude. It was how he wanted things to be. Nobody bored, nobody withdrawn, everyone with something to say or to listen to. I have to say, you've met quite a few people for only being here. Well, how long has it been? Marie asked. Oh, long enough, he said, to play it off, both question and answer, as a joke. Robert said something about investing in gold. He and Marie started talking, and Marie watched and listened. Neil couldn't say how long it had been since he'd left Dublin for England, and it didn't interest him. Working in private equity, it had been an easy choice to make. There had been no shop to close up or land to sell. There had been nothing, bureaucracy, roots, or family, to hold him back. He'd received a good offer from an English firm to work as a financial analyst. The position was the same as what he'd had in Dublin. The pay wasn't, and neither was the work. The firm was bigger than any other he'd worked at, and there was more to be done because of it. He looked at setting out for England as something as an adventure, one thrust upon him by the two countries' circumstances. It was his nature to try turning a negative into a positive, even if it took some work. Wanting to embrace his new home, he had visited museums and bought himself books on English history. He felt obliged to set himself apart, to make it clear that he wasn't one of those who came looking for a job and would get out quick if things didn't go as planned. The rest of it was the curiosity he felt in any new setting, which gave him a remarkably broad view of where he lived and its history, and of so much else besides. That was why he had listened intently at first, and then less so, to Marie talk about her conference. Not having been there for some time now, he was fond of what he remembered of Dublin. There, in an earlier life, he had thought about becoming a doctor, learning Latin in pursuit of this, and learning Gaelic because he had to. He took so well to Latin that the little he would have needed stayed with him after his ambitions as a doctor had passed. Fond as he was of Dublin, he'd come to see his move to England as more and more of a necessity. He liked Dublin, he maintained, but beyond that, the country didn't really exist. Had he stayed, what career could he have had? He could have done well for himself, in fact, though not as well as he had done here. He exaggerated how different each outcome would have been. When he had set on doing something and had begun to see how it would turn out, he began to believe it couldn't have gone any other way. Marie had asked him one day why he had moved, and that was what he had told her. He had told her what he had invested in privately, too, and that these were only predictions he had backed up with only as much money as he was prepared to lose. Throughout his explanation, Marie had a withdrawn look on her face that came from attempting to take all of this in as he said it. Well, I hadn't thought about it like that, she said, by which she meant that she, like everyone else not involved in these things, especially private equity, hadn't thought about it much at all. She dutifully paid into her pension plan and had met with a financial advisor twice in her life. She wasn't ashamed of her ignorance, but aware of it, and so she took what he said on faith. Now Marie asked him how things were at work, and he again gave an answer that said nothing. To say something more definitive would mean thinking about it for longer than he wanted to bear. Neil, I wanted to get your opinion on this. Gold's doing well, isn't it? Robert chimed in. I thought I heard something about some country or other getting a good deal on their gold mines. I think it was Angola. Neil was glad that Robert, saying this, had turned the conversation to the news. Michael thought it was Angola, too. Well, a good deal for them is a bad deal for whoever buys it from him, he continued, not wanting Michael continued, not wanting to leave it at that, but unable to contribute much more. Did you hear about it, Neil? Anything in the news? Michael asked. I'll see, Neil said. He took his reading glasses from his breast pocket, stood up, and hunted down the newspaper on a table in another room. Should be in the business section, he said, as he came back, flipping through the pages. Not only was there no mention of Angola's gold, which he explained as a lapse in memory, but part of the business section seemed to be missing. He got up again and rifled through the inside pockets of his jackets until he found what he was looking for, the business section's missing half, folded over twice to make it fit. Here it is, he cried triumphantly, holding it up for them to see. It was a long paper rectangle, with creases where he had folded it, and where he unfolded it, it became a full page of newspaper again. Looking it over, he recognized the picture of the miners at work. He had wanted to talk about it himself, and had carried it in his jacket pocket to reread when he had a moment to spare. The articles he kept were only the best, those that really spoke to him, and which he wanted to discuss. That was how he approached their talks, always with something to say in reserve. Skimming the article, the words came back to him and stirred up his thoughts, though not as powerfully as they had done when he had read it for the first time. He began to read aloud, skipping around to better hold their attention and get to the point. He kept the paper with him until he thought he could summarize it, and then he gave it to Marie, telling her to take a look. When she was done, it went round to Robert and then to Michael. Not having the time to read it all like him, they first looked at the picture and then at the article, their eyes drawn to the quotes that stood out among the rest of the text. And then to Michael. Like him, they first looked at the picture and then at the article, their eyes drawn to the quotes that stood out among the rest of the text, larger than what surrounded them, and which the editor had selected to make that skimming possible. He told them while they read that he had nothing to do with gold except in his private investments. He shared his predictions with them and said he had bought gold himself, though he cautioned them not to be too hasty. He didn't want to sour their friendship with bad advice, he said. His next subject had come from a question someone asked, and at other times it might come to him suddenly and have nothing to do with what the others said. Sometimes he prepared them for what he wanted to say with a question. He had been reading about the history of English and wanted to make use of that and his Latin. When they had finished with Angola's gold mines, he listed some examples from the book he was reading, Adventure, Boycott, and Simony, and asked them whether they knew where they came from. Knowing what was about to happen, they admitted that they didn't. The first was Latin, he said, and the others were names of people, one who had tried to bribe the apostles, and another whom some Irish farmers had boycotted. He seemed to lecture, but to do so with a certain charm. It came from the humility he usually showed when he listened to them and learned of things he knew nothing about. His explanations were definitive, and for a discussion to happen, he needed something less complete. They each, first Marie and then Michael, and last of all Robert, had examples of their own to give, and they talked at such length about them that Neil never came around to asking them his most important question. Why should the name of a now obscure English land agent survive as the word boycott? Why did he survive and not others? Simony, he said, was easy to explain. Simon Magus had been in the Bible to give a name to that particular sin, and the word had spread from there. That was how Neil had tried, while nobody else had yet touched on the subject, to set up his question. Then Marie broke in with an example of her own, and he lost control of the conversation. The questions he put to them were ones he had asked himself, and for which, if it was at all possible, He had discovered a number of answers by going over them alone, again and again. He didn't stick with the first answer he found, and then polish and rehearse and memorize it. He abandoned it and tried to find another, or to find another reason for an answer he already had. Pacing through his house as he did when deep in thought, and walking faster when on the cusp of a breakthrough, going at it from every angle he could think of, he would map out the territory of the subject at hand. Having done this, he'd have a handful of answers to take to his friends. He liked it when they surprised him, as they did with the examples they gave. "You've given me something to think about," he said, and this added to their impression of him as a lecturer. He resolved to keep his question for another time. The day of the conference arrived. Neil called Marie from his office a little before her lecture was to start, late in the afternoon. Time being short, they talked quickly, with a false sense of urgency and some excitement. Marie told him about the other lectures she had heard. He made note of their subjects so he could ask her about them later, and tried to take her mind off her own lecture. Each tried to say what they could in the time they had, and what there wasn't time what there wasn't time enough for wasn't really important. And what there wasn't enough time for wasn't really important. They would have more time when it was over, he thought. Over. He wished her luck and thought about what she was doing while he worked. He worked through her lecture and through her taking questions from the audience. Then he waited a little more in case it took longer than she said it would. When he called for her for the second time, she had hardly anything to say. He had to start her off. And how did or she had hardly anything to say. "And how did it go?" he asked. "I think it went well," she said. "You think?" "I know." She convinced neither of them. He was sure she'd won them over. She had practiced enough, and the rest was just nerves. She supposed that was true. If you really charm them, you'll get the attention of somebody in government. Maybe the mayor, maybe a minister, he said. Oh, stop. Might get another research grant, might even get tenure. You might get another research grant, might even get tenure. You'll have it good and get it from my taxes too, he teased. He laughed with a liveliness that had not been there before. It was a long-standing joke of theirs that she was angling for a position in government and that he resented paying taxes. There was some truth to that. She liked the security of a government job, and he didn't like the waste of a number of programs. But he had nothing against her, nothing at all. How could he, when he had liked so much to hear about her research? He ignored how it had come to bore him, and he forgave her for that. It was nerves, like he'd said. It was too much of a good thing, he thought. That was why he'd been bored. Working in private equity, he saw what companies were struggling and learned something about the industries they were in, too. Much in the same way, his friends gave him a glimpse into their own lines of work. He was curious and gained from what they said a deeper view of the many things he had only heard of. The world opened out in front of him then, and seemed a bit more extraordinary for his having understood it better. That was how he'd felt when Marie first talked about her lecture. She lost him the more she went on. She lost him the more she went on and repeated it herself. She lost him the more she went into it. On and repeated herself. Without a passion for the subject like she had, it got to be too much. It was easier, he felt, to listen to someone like Robert. He owned a small chain of motels. Their name had nothing to do with his own, so it came as a surprise when Robert told him who he was. Their names came from their surroundings, as Robert had explained, like Lakeview or Desert Hills or the street they were on, or from whatever was nearest. Robert pointed the motels out to him if they should see them around. There were others scattered about the country, and some in America even. Robert said that with pride in the headway they were making. Michael, too, was easy to listen to. He was a lawyer specializing in labor law. For a while after Neil had met him, this was all he said about his job, except when he won or lost a case. Then he said only that much to explain the mood he was in, and only if Neil asked about it. He worked late sometimes when the case demanded it, and this, as Marie's conferences were for her, was the most common reason why he sometimes let plans fall through. It could go on for weeks, for months, but no one held it against him. They knew how much he would have liked to be with them and waited patiently until the hours he was expected to keep grew less demanding. Neil had met Michael while he was under more pressure than usual. What Neil took as him being distant, asking himself why he came to visit with Marie and Robert if he wasn't going to say much, was far from how he really was. As the pressure let up, he talked more about his work, knowing that Neil was interested, and Neil told him how he'd misjudged him. "I wish I had your gift for shutting up," Neil said. For him, just the sight of some people was all it took to start him talking, and once he started, he realized more and more how much there was to say. So did those he talked to. Michael spoke of his cases in terms of abstract legal principles, avoiding anything told in confidence and omitting the names of all involved. Neil listened mostly, but his presence was in no way diminished by this. He was a heavy-set man with thick lips and large eyes, and this seemed to magnify nearly everything he did, his emotions becoming as large as the face that expressed them. A sweep of his hand to illustrate a point, even a gesture as small as stroking his chin, appeared more meaningful than it would have with a man of smaller stature. After Marie, it was Michael whom he missed most of all when he wasn't there. Neil enjoyed himself so much when Michael came to visit that he could entirely lose track of time. Realizing how late it was, Michael would spring up, panic-stricken, and exclaiming that he hadn't meant to stay that long. Shocked by his carelessness, he would gather his things and go, and yet, however he hurried, he would always say goodbye. Watching him go, Neil said how good it had been to see each other, unbothered by his hurry and even a little amused by it. Michael would hear that amusement in his voice, low and penetrating even when quiet as it often was, and mistake it for Neil trying to calm him down. He thought of Neil as a steadying influence, pointing out as he collected his things what he had forgotten and where he would find it. "Your coat," Neil would say, pointing to the coat rack. Neil took his shoes off at home, and expected it of his guests too. It had happened more than once that Neil had shouted after Michael not to leave his shoes behind. Michael would come back, embarrassed, and Neil would laugh, enjoying himself immensely at Michael's confusion. Michael came when he could, alone or with the others. Whenever Marie or Robert came to visit, Neil made sure to propose when they would meet again before they left. They had schedules he could plan around and didn't work late like Michael did. Neil would suggest a date and time. This time he'd said next Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, and next Saturday at 2, and everyone present, should there be no objections, would take it as understood that that was when it would be. The responsibility, as he thought of it, of making sure they met so invariably fell to him that he sometimes felt they wouldn't meet as often as this, or maybe not at all, if he weren't there. The thought, which with time and the evidence he gathered, for and against it, from memory, became a theory that began to disturb him. He was a little glad, therefore, when he fell ill, and remembering that idea, thought to put it to the test. He called Michael to say he was sick and couldn't make it this time. Michael said he was sorry to hear that, and that he had to work anyway. Well, they're keeping him late again, Neil said to himself after he'd hung up. He pictured Michael hunched over at his desk, poring over papers with the light of a desk lamp. He had turned it on, Neil imagined, as it had gotten dark. Was that how it was at a law firm? Should he think of fluorescent lights instead? He wasn't sure. There were other things he wasn't sure about. Still, the picture had come to him in precisely that way, before he had time to reflect on his doubts. Before he had had time for doubts. He called Marie and Robert, and one after another they said that they too couldn't make it. They were sorry about that, and about Michael, and to hear he was sick. His suspicions grew with each reply of this kind, and when they had all dropped out, he backed his suspicions with this new evidence. When the day came on which they should have met, he thought of what he was doing then, reading the newspaper, and what he would have been doing at that same hour had things gone ahead as planned. It occurred to him that they had, with few exceptions, always met at his house or at a place he had suggested. His illness, then, had meant a change of plans and put them on too short a notice to find a new place to meet. Realizing this, he knew things were not as serious as he had suspected. Realizing this, he knew things that were not as serious as he had thought, and that they always came at the date and time he'd suggested, and that they had always came when he'd suggested because they thought that was what worked for him. He was amazed at what a fright he had given himself, what an idea he had gotten into his head. Reading the newspaper took him longer than usual. It was hard to do anything, so he figured he might as well read, slow as he was, and when that got to be too much for him, he sat at the table and did nothing. Feeling poorly, he did nothing. Feeling better, he picked up the paper again. Feeling better, he picked up the paper, tentatively, taking his condition and its changes as they came. From these periods of exhaustion, he knew just how sick he was, and was glad he'd had the foresight to call off their get-together. He consoled himself with the thought that, for everything he had missed, the next time they would meet would be all the richer. It pleased him to have thought of this. He read the newspaper with increased attention, noting what was of interest to him and to his friends, worth mentioning possibly the next time they met. There was another article on developments in the largest gold mine in Angola for Michael. For himself, he found announcements of new museums exhibitions, and as he read on, he knew he would find something for Marie and Robert too. That was Mapping the Territory, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to read along as I read this text, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.